Sciences from the University of Utah. I've known Court now for over 10 years, and it was a really sort of fun collaboration in how we met, which I'll let Court kind of tell the story a little bit. But ultimately, this is a true sort of example of interdisciplinary research in the sense that my background's in avian ecology and the impact of climate change on wildlife. And Court and I got together as part of a working group and just started thinking about climate dynamics, atmospheric sciences, and how these things that I know nothing about influence animal populations. And since then, it's really been a lot of fun and a great collaboration. What I would say about Court is that he actually did his undergraduate in communications and meteorology. He spent 7 years as effectively a weatherman, broadcast meteorologist, which actually really was very useful for me because when we'd have meetings, he would always be drawing things and like animating them. And I'd be like, yeah, this is great. I totally get it. But he went on to do his master's and his PhD in atmospheric sciences at UVA. And then has gone on to do great work. He gets regular funding from NSF and NOAA. He's had really high impact publications in Nature Communications, PNAS, and geophysical research letters. And so it's really, it's always fun to hang out with Court and for me to learn more about climate dynamics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Court.
All right, thanks Ben for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to see you here. Thanks for the opportunity to come speak at the university and interact with the faculty and students. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. Title here is Climate Drivers of Facultative Avian Migration, and what I have on the screen there is the cover shot from Trends in Ecology and Evolution. This is a paper led by Ben, focusing on climate dipoles and their influence on plant and animal populations. So there's a couple of key things on that image there, which I'll refer to a lot. One is pine siskin, that's the species. I needed to depend on Ben to tell me that since I can't tell a blue jay from a robin, but he told me that's pine siskin. It's one of the birds that exhibit this interesting migratory behavior, which we'll talk about today. And then the other big thing here is a dipole. So I'll use that word dipole a lot. A dipole is a pattern where you have two oppositely signed centers of action adjacent to each other. And it could be, so they go up and down like this. It could be temperature going up and down, it could be sea level pressure, it could be the population of a bird in this case, or more interestingly, both of those things happening together. So the juxtaposition of a climate and an ecological dipole is of big interest. So most of the research that I do is actually in the area of the atmosphere's interaction with the cryosphere, which is a frozen part of the climate system. That's where I get most of my funding. But some of the projects that are closest to my heart are those that touch on other parts of the Earth system, especially ecology. And my interest in that, I think, goes back to graduate school. So as Ben mentioned, I did graduate work at University of Virginia, and there are several sciences in one department there. So atmospheric science, ecology, geology, and hydrology all together, presumably interacting, although that's the really challenging part of it. But so I'd say early on in my graduate years, I started to think about these interdisciplinary problems, and then fast forward, I'm a young assistant professor at University of Utah in 2012, and Julio Betancourt, now scientist emeritus from USGS, visits and gives a talk called For Everything There Is a Season, Phenology in a Changing World. And many of you probably know Julio. If you don't, this scientist's work has been on the cover of Nature multiple times. So he's really a leader in thinking about climate and ecology problems. And so I was very interested to hear what he had to say. And he described this chasm between ecology and between ecology and climate, and said that there are very few scientists trying to bridge across that, yet some of the most interesting problems reside at that interface. And so I had a chance to meet with him later, and I asked, what are the interesting problems that you were referring to? Because as a climate scientist, I might want to tackle some of these. Fortunately, he took the question seriously, went off and thought about it for a couple of weeks, and he came back with a word that I hadn't heard before, which is eruption. So this is the sudden change in the population density of an organism. An example is the movement of northern wintering species to the south in years of low food availability. And he said the real champion of this behavior is this so-called pine siskin. They're happy to live in the boreal forest when they have enough food, but they make their way south in huge numbers when they lack seed supply. And I said that is a fascinating problem, and I was interested in working on it, but knew nothing about birds. And so he hooked me up with Ben Zuckerberg to bring in the expertise and the avian part of the picture. After working together for a while, we realized we needed the expertise in the food supply for these birds as well, which is the mast seeding. So we started working with Jaylene La Montagne, and then I hired at the time, PhD student who's a bi, to work in my group, who's now an assistant professor at Vanderbilt. And then the other big part of the team here is the citizen scientists who collect these bird observations that we've been studying as part of Project Feeder Watch, which provides observations from 1989 to present. And then of course I also want to acknowledge NSF for funding this research. So one of the first things that Ben and I did together was just looking at some spatial patterns of the count of pine siskin. So we took the pine siskin observations from Feeder Watch, arranged them onto a grid, and just started looking at some maps to see some of these patterns that Julio was describing. So in some years, these birds appear in large numbers across the continental US without much apparent in the boreal forest. Other years we don't see many over the entire observation grid. And there's also a tendency for the numbers to concentrate, say, in the western boreal forest or the eastern boreal forest. And so we'd like some way to objectively organize these data so that we can understand the principal modes of variation in them. And so we used a method called empirical orthogonal function analysis, or EOF analysis. This statistical method is equivalent to what's known as principal components analysis, or PCA, in other fields. So if you've seen one of these, you've seen the other. In climate science, we tend to call them EOFs, which is what I'll use today. And when you perform EOF analysis on a data set like this, you get two things out of it. You get a spatial pattern for the mode, and you get a time series index of how that mode is varying over time. And we usually organize these so that the first pattern is the one that accounts for the most variance, and then subsequent patterns account for as much of the remaining variance as possible. So the first mode we refer to as the north-south mode because it captures a tendency for bird counts to either be high over the boreal forest or high over the southeastern US. And if you look at an index of that mode, when it's positive, we see a couple of examples of it being positive here and here, that means that bird counts are anomalously high over the southern US and anomalously low in the boreal forest, whereas a negative value of the index, such as we see here, is the opposite. So counts anomalously high in the forest and low over the southeast US. Okay, in addition to the north-south mode of variability, or once we identify that, we look for the climate patterns which appear to be driving it, because as Julio described it, presumably there's a climate signal that drives a seed anomaly, which then triggers the birds to move. And so what we found was anomalously wet conditions 1 year prior during spring over the boreal forest, and anomalously dry conditions over the southeast, where dry conditions would be more conducive to productions of seed. And then we also found a tendency for cold conditions over the boreal forest in the winter just prior to the eruptive movement. And then using these climate signals, we produced a statistical model of that eruption, which accounts for 58% of the variance shown there in blue. So after we looked at that first mode, the statistical method provides the second mode as being orthogonal to it. So the second mode comes out with zero correlation to the first mode, which has some statistical convenience for it, and it can also help us with interpretation in some cases. Here, the spatial pattern of that second mode is an east-west dipole. So that first mode we called north-south, this one we call east-west. You can see the time series for it in red there, and then again we built a statistical model of that using precipitation and temperature, and the underlying climate signal there is an east-west dipole in precipitation aligned with an east-west dipole in temperature. And so seeing these relationships between the bird counts and the underlying climate variability, we assembled together a schematic of the climate modes shown in blue here for the north-south mode at the top and the west-east mode on the bottom, and then the associated eruption patterns, which are shown by these gray boxes on the right. What we didn't have at the time was the seed data, but we inferred it. So knowing something about the reproductive tendencies of the trees, we could infer, for example, wet conditions might lead to a small seed crop the next year, and those seed crops made sense as the in-between piece, right? So we knew the climate, we had that observed, we knew the birds, we had that observed. We made an inference here in this paper about what the intervening seed patterns were. Eventually, through collaborating with J. Lee and La Montagne, we got our hands on some seed data and found that indeed, in retrospect, we had it right. So the green boxes indicating these large and small seed crops over different parts of the boreal forest do line up nicely with the patterns that we were seeing in the birds, and they alternate year to year. So, for example, here we see an anomalously large seed crop to the east with an anomalously small to the west. That tends to flip around in conjunction with the lead into this eruptive behavior. Okay, so the atmospheric science question here that was of interest to us is what produces that east-west dipole in temperature and precipitation? So apparently over North America there's this east-west seesaw in climatic conditions which drives the west-east mode. And so starting with that one, we here again use empiric orthogonal function analysis, but now we're analyzing, instead of looking at the birds, we're looking at the climate system. And the variable that we're looking at here is referred to as 200 hectopascal geopotential height. So that's the height that you need to go up to in the atmosphere to reach 200 hectopascals, which is about 20% of surface pressure. So that's about 10 to 12 kilometers up in the atmosphere. And what we're looking at is wave patterns. And so the leading pattern of waves, that's the first mode coming from EUF analysis, is more of a monopole over North America with the Gulf of Alaska trough. So that's not the pattern we're looking for. What that is it's basically El Nino, or actually more specifically La Nina. So if you look at that wave pattern in the atmosphere and seek the associated ocean surface temperature pattern, you'll find a characteristic La Nina signature in the tropical Pacific. So this is a well-known mode. It's not the one we're looking for, but it was nice to see it pop out of the statistical analysis. This is the mode we're looking for. So it's the second mode that comes from EUF analysis, and it does have the dipole over North America that we're looking for. The tropical signature for it is weak though, so it's not, at least the way we're looking at it here, it's not clearly driven by ocean temperatures in the tropics, but it does have a very nice wave structure to it here, and there may also be another wave extending over toward East Asia. As soon as I saw that pattern and the clear atmospheric wave structure in it, I naively thought, yeah, we could probably explain that in like 3 or 4 months of work. Wrong. Okay, it took my PhD student, who was a Bai who worked on this, reminded me a few weeks ago. She said, no, Court, that took us 2 years to publish that paper. So that was a very challenging problem. As it turns out, this dipole comes from 2 different sources. It does come from East Asian monsoonal convection, but there's some interference from an interesting tropical source, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So the first thing we did to analyze this was we tried to construct an index of the pattern. We already have one here, which is coming from the EUF analysis. But we wanted to extend that back in time, so we have shown here a few signals. The blue is the birds in the west-east mode of eruption. The red is the measurement of this North American dipole pattern in a modern atmospheric data set referred to as ERA 5. And then what we were able to do is extend it all the way back to the late 1800s using a 20th century reanalysis atmospheric product. Which gives us a proxy for perhaps what the birds were doing if the relationship between them is stationary. And so with that longer record, then we asked the question, what produces that east-west dipole over North America? So indeed, part of it does come from East Asian monsoonal convection. So if you measure, say, storminess here off the east coast of Asia, and you look at the composite anomalies for strong versus weak East Asian monsoon summers, the strong East Asian monsoon summers have this beautiful atmospheric wave propagating across the Pacific Ocean and reaching North America to produce that east-west dipole that we were looking for. So certainly that East Asian monsoonal convection is a piece of the puzzle. And there's an associated surface temperature dipole and there's an associated sea surface temperature dipole that helps to trigger that convection. So that's one clear piece of it, and if it were that simple, we probably would have had it in a few months of research. The complexity comes in from something called the Madden-Julian oscillation. So how many of you have heard of the MJO? Many of you. There may be some experts in this department on it as well. In terms of tropical variability, this is a fascinating pattern highlighted in this paper by Madden and Julian in 1971. So what they found is this juxtaposition. This is another example of a dipole where you have upward motion and storminess juxtaposed next to downward motion, sunny and dry conditions. And what's fascinating is that this dipole of convection moves across the tropics, as illustrated here, through what are usually referred to as 8 phases. And this cycle of the convection starting and then moving to the east across the tropics happens with a 40 to 50 day oscillation. And usually when people study this MJO, they filter out the lower frequency variations beyond, say, 110 days. In this research, we retained those, so we kept the lower frequency oscillations, and what we found was that the MJO preferentially sits in a couple of different phases from one year to the next. So some years might be uniform, where we see an even number of all the phases, but if you keep these lower frequency oscillations in the MJO, you'll see that it preferentially sits in a couple of different phases. And in fact, this is another example of EUF analysis where we used a statistical method to uncover what phases it preferentially sits in, and on a longer time scale, it tends to oscillate between phases 1 and 6, or preferentially occur more strongly or more frequently in phase 1 or phase 6. That's in fact its leading mode of variability. And those patterns line up very nicely with the North American dipole. So what we're showing over here is composites by MJO phase. So when MJO is in phase 1, this is what the atmosphere looks like. When it's in phase 6, this is what the atmosphere looks like. And the color shading here indicates suppression of storminess in brown, and then regions of enhanced storminess in green. And that aligns nicely with what we see happening in the atmosphere. So it's stormy, dry, stormy. That lines up with the contouring we have down here, which also indicates storminess, calm conditions, and storminess. And that tripole pattern of convection or storminess in the tropics is associated with this dipole structure over North America. And we were able to reproduce that in global climate modeling experiments as well. So by introducing heating anomalies in the tropics to trigger that convection pattern, we were able to replicate that dipole structure over North America. And then if we look at it in the phase 6 spatial pattern, we again see that dipole of calm conditions over the eastern Indian Ocean, storminess over the maritime continent, which is matched by the pattern of convection. We see the dipole structure of North America shift. So we have evidence here then that there are 2 patterns that contribute to the North American dipole. It's variations in the phase in which MJO occurs, combined with the East Asian monsoon convection. The interesting thing about it is that they're not just linearly additive. It's the East Asian monsoonal convection is more apparent as a driver of the North American dipole when the MJO is more uniform. So when the MJO is preferentially in phase 1 or 6, that seems to interfere with that East Asian monsoon teleconnection, whereas when the MJO is more uniform, we more clearly see the effect of the East Asian monsoon. And that's why the problem was so challenging to untangle. Okay, I want to transition back to the north-south mode. So the north-south mode is as I mentioned, it's the leading mode of variability. So if we ask for what accounts for the most variance in the pine siskin counts, it is this tendency to either see them to the north or to the south. The time series from that is super interesting. So if we look at an index of that over time, again, when the index is positive, it means that counts are anomalously high where the spatial pattern is positive, and anomalously low where it's negative. And then if you look at a negative year, let's say here, the pattern is reversed. You have anomalously high counts in the boreal forest and low counts over the continental US. So what's striking about this pattern that differs from the west-east mode is the tendency for it to occur intermittently. And this was something that Julio Betancourt highlighted when he first described this problem to me. He said it's, if you're living down here in the southeast US, in Georgia, you might never see a pine siskin for year after year after year, and then suddenly in 1 year, there'll be 300 at your feeder, right? And then you'll go another 10 years and see 0. And so it's this intermittency of the phenomenon that was quite interesting. And this is a long-standing, this centers around long-standing questions of episodic events in ecology. This is an example of a paper describing that by my colleague Ben, which brings us to the question of why does this happen episodically? And this is another very interesting moment in the research. When I first saw that time, I think Ben and I probably saw that like maybe back in 2012 or something, or 2010 or something. And I thought to myself, well, that's super interesting because it appears oscillatory, and I envisioned like maybe, out here somewhere there would be another positive case, and I thought to myself, well, we have many examples of these slow frequency oscillations in the climate system, and they have names like multi-decadal oscillations, right? So we have plenty of these. I'm sure we can find one that will explain this. Wrong. It's actually not a multi-decadal oscillation. So as we started to look more carefully at this, and we only just did this recently, because this was kind of on the back burner for a long time, and I thought, well, we'll get back and figure out it's the such and such multi-decadal oscillation. And it turned out not to be the case. So to review the pattern that we're trying to explain here, it's the north-south mode of pine siskin eruption. If you look at the circulation feature associated with it, it's not the dipole that we talked about before for the west-east mode. Rather, it's more like a monopole. Well, it's really a dipole with the Gulf of Alaska, but in terms of what's happening over North America, it's basically a ridge or an area of high pressure parked over central Canada. And the associated C pattern that goes with that is a reduction in masting or failure of masting across much of the boreal forest. And so the idea is that you have the usual west-east mode going on, you have some sizable population of pine siskins, and then suddenly the whole forest shuts down, presumably in response to this ridge, and you get reduced masting across a very large area, presumably leading to the eruption to the south. And so the question becomes, what causes that ridge of high pressure? That could plausibly be something that the atmosphere produces through a multi-decadal oscillation, but it's actually not. So to study that, we produced an index of this North American ridge just by looking at the pressure over central Canada, and then correlating that with what's happening in the atmosphere all around it gives us what looks like a wave structure in the atmosphere. And we plot here a couple of time series to illustrate that. So the blue is the index of the north-south mode, so that's tracking the north-south migration of the birds. The red curve here is an index of this North American ridge, or NAR pattern, as we called it. And so the question becomes, what causes that ridge? Is it something that happens with a multi-decadal time scale? Turns out no. So if we look at it here, we can see a couple of different patterns that are identified, again, through empirical orthogonal function analysis. So we perform a statistical analysis on the atmosphere, in this case independent of the birds, to see if we can discover the patterns that drive the bird variability. And what we find is the leading two modes of variability, this is mode 1 and mode 2, for the circulation over this region, both feature this ridge over central North America, which aligns nicely with the ridge that we're looking for. So these are candidate drivers of that pattern. And the way I describe these is you have a ridge over North America in both cases, but there's a dipole structure, in this case over the Atlantic, referred to as the North Atlantic Oscillation. And then in this one, there's a dipole structure over the Pacific, referred to as the North Pacific Oscillation. So these were known patterns prior to our research. Our purpose here was to discover the relationship to each other, which is actually zero correlation. So the way we did this analysis, these two modes are orthogonal to each other, so they're uncorrelated. Okay, so you imagine you have two modes where they're uncorrelated. One is a north-south dipole over the Atlantic, the other is a north-south dipole over the Pacific, but both of them are associated with this ridge over North America. And the North Atlantic oscillation is shown here in its positive polarity, the North Pacific here also in its positive polarity. So imagine you have two climate signals that are uncorrelated. They're both fluctuating, but with no correlation with each other. When they happen to occur in their positive polarity, right, they could each be negative, neutral, or positive. If they happen to occur in their positive polarity, they're associated with a ridge over North America. So the innovative idea here is that the north-south eruption, which is driven by this ridge here, occurs when these two modes, the NAO and the NPO, happen to coincide in their positive phase, right? So imagine you have two uncorrelated indices that could be negative, neutral, or positive. They're fluctuating, and then some years they happen to occur together in their positive phase. And so if you have two modes, both of which can take on three polarities, positive, negative, or neutral, what's the probability that they occur together in their positive phase? So we can write that out this way. So a probability that the NAO is positive, intersection with the probability that the NPO is positive, the chance that they both happen together and they're positive would be the probability that the NAO is positive multiplied by the probability that the NPO is positive given that the NAO is negative. So this conditional probability is actually the same as just the probability of positive NPO if these are independent, which they are, because these have zero correlation. So that simplifies to just simply the product of these two things, right? So the probability that we get positive NAO and positive NPO is just simply the product of their individual probabilities. So probability of positive NAO, maybe it's a third, we'll say, right? If it's normally distributed, you get a third of the values, we'll call it positive, and then the probability of the NPO being positive, also a third. The product of those is 1/9, which gives you something around a decade, right? And if you have a short time record and you happen to miss it once, you get 2 decades, so that wouldn't be shocking. But the idea here is that rather than seeking some kind of potentially mysterious multi-decadal oscillation in the climate system, we can just simply have two randomly fluctuating independent oscillations whose probability of being positive is a third, the chance of them both being positive is a 1/9. Right? So this would be a potential explanation for multi-decadal or episodic periodic behavior in ecosystems. Okay, so I want to return back to this image that we had on the title slide. And again, the title of that paper is Climate Dipoles as Continental Drivers of Plant and Animal Populations. I think our objective here was to be broad and look at a large range of relationships in the natural system. But from my perspective, the spirit of this paper was very much a call for ecologically driven climate science, which is what I think I've shared some examples of today. So in that paper, we show a couple of kind of idealized schematics of the way things typically get done and a lot of research that we see, and then the way that we'd like to encourage research to move forward. So up on the top here, there's a tendency for the climate community to study climate science for the purpose of climate science, right? So we are interested in what are those things in the climate system that account for the most variability in the climate system, right? Things like El Nino or the North Atlantic Oscillation. And so we produce these spatial patterns and associated temporal indices. And then when we work with ecologists, or ecologists go out on their own to do this kind of research, these kind of off-the-shelf existing, pre-shrink wrap type indices are readily available online. And oftentimes we could seek correlation between those pre-made indices and the ecological indices with some success. I mean, there's hundreds of papers doing that, right? But what we found a more powerful approach that we encourage is to begin with the ecological data, and before looking at the climate system, understand the spatial patterns in the ecological data. Discover the associated time series, And then as we've shown in the examples of work here today, once you have that ecological time series, then go to the climate data. And what's fascinating about this arrow here is we're often discovering patterns that we may not have known about before, or at least we weren't paying much attention to before. So an example of that would be the North American dipole that I focused on here. That was a previously unnamed pattern. It occurs in summer over the North American sector. At least to our review, we couldn't find any other scientists studying that particular pattern. So by beginning with the bird data in this case, and the counts of pine siskin, it led us to discover a new pattern in the climate system. And often, this is like when they show you a commercial, this is the way you used to be doing it, but you could do it this way. So this is like, do your climate time series look like this? Well, they could look like this, right? So it's like I'm trying to sell it here, but the idea is start with the ecology, and that's very much in the spirit of the work that I've been doing with Ben. Okay, so in summary, I've presented some examples of ecologically driven study of climate variability. So start with the ecology that will point to what's interesting in the natural system, and then we go find the climate patterns that explain it. We highlighted 2 eruption modes for pine siskin, which we were able to successfully pair with climate-driven seed production anomalies. So the basic idea is the climate anomalies produce an anomaly in seed counts, which then affect the bird population, sometimes at fairly long lags as well. So we had multiple years that we were looking at. We identified an east-west mode. This is associated with atmospheric waves generated by East Asian monsoonal storminess and Madden Julian oscillation. That research problem ended up being a lot more complicated than I initially thought, largely due to the interaction between these 2 phenomenon. And then I highlighted a north-south mode, which is a superposition of positive North Atlantic oscillation and positive North Pacific oscillation. And surprisingly, both of those modes are more interannual. They're not fundamentally decadal in their variation. What is approximately decadal is the tendency for both of them to occur in their positive polarity together. And that's what we think to be the explanation for the episodic occurrence of the north-south mode. It's the slides I have for you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you look at other birds as well, other than the pine siskins, that have like similar migration patterns over North America?
Yes, so it was very important as I started this work to get the cues from the ecologists as to which birds to be looking at. So both Julio Ben and Gordon Ben Zuckerberg told me you got to look at pine siskin. But they clued me in that there were some others, like crossbill. Ben, do you want to
Sure.
talk a little bit about that?
Ivy?
Why me? Yeah, there are other species that do it. I was a PhD student with Ben and worked with Court, and so less on the atmospheric science side of it, but on the ecological side of it, we looked at various species of boreal finches that have different frequencies of this behavior. So the pine siskin is one that's like can be around decadal, but we have like red poles that are like almost every other year. They're doing this behavior.
Is the pine siskin chosen because of like the eruption of the species and stuff, or like why specifically the pine siskin in the first place?
Why'd you guys choose?
Yeah, it's also the one that has one of the highest seed dependence on the seed. So a lot of these species do these eruptive-like patterns, but some of them are more or less locked in on that seed source. And so pine siskins are really cued in. But I would say the other thing that shows almost decadal component is they do something called super flights, where multiple species all erupt at the same time. And so at your feeders, you'll see like a dozen of these boreal bird species that wouldn't normally be there showing up at the same time.
Yes.
I thought pine siskins waited until the PV gradient reversed for the trigger. No,
Did we until the what?
until the PV gradient reversed.
That's
I would
what
just
I'm
make
looking for.
an allusion to your fine work on Rossby wave break.
Appreciate that.
So in this east-west mode, you've had some success in defining it. In general, it's kind of displacement of the long wave pattern more generally, right? So by your approach, you clearly identify a subset, maybe up to 75% or something of things going on. But then I look at certain dates, and I couldn't tell exactly which they were, maybe 2008 and 1998, I don't know. One of them says maybe El Nino, the other one might say, you know, there was a big snow event with 78 tornado deaths here in 2008. Was that related to some other pattern? Or could your idea of blending these two actually explain other kinds of weather events that we ascribe to other things in the past?
Yeah, so you're talking about like the NPO and NAO co-occurrence.
Yeah, you have a couple of peaks in the upper right. I don't know if that middle one is 98. I can't see it.
So
Or
98 would be like here.
Oh, then 89 for that one?
yeah, is that 89?
I don't know.
Then that's like the eruption.
Oh, for the eruption? Yeah. it's
Yeah,
right, you know.
You know, because when you look at plots like that, you kind of immediately think of, well, was there an ENSO event that could be related to that or some other thing? And I don't know.
Yeah, I think I think we have this lag so that the climate signal is shifted back, or there's a 2-year lag which we've imposed here so that the climate aligns with the birds. It would be shifting the climate forward. Yeah. So that peak in the climate signal actually happened 2 years prior, so it would be 87.
Maybe I should just ask a simpler thing, which is, do you think it should be called a planetary wave shift or a North American dipole?
It got published as that, so.
It's already published, so
There you
I
go.
realize I'm being improper.
Well, that's what I was saying, is that you prefer a planetary wave shift, otherwise you
I
wouldn't
don't
ask the
know.
question, right?
It's more inclusive.
Yeah, so in that sense, you mean that there's like a preferential Rossby wave position that gets shifted?
Yeah, like the ridge over the west coast in climatology in January shifted east sometimes.
Right.
We don't know why. But
Yeah.
you have a subset, a 75% subset of the explanation, which is pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, and as to what the dynamics are, I mean, it took us as a community, really probably, well, several decades to untangle the dynamics of the NAO. Right? I mean, essentially is Rossby wave breaking, but how that ties to the upstream ridge dynamically, I think is not yet clear, at least to me. Similarly, how the NPO ties to that ridge, also not entirely clear, but it's an important science frontier to understand that if we do claim that, I mean, this is just a co-occurrence, right? But if we actually wanted to argue dynamically that that upstream ridge is somehow related to that dipole, we would need some more careful dynamics analysis, which might lead us to call it a, what did you call it again? A displacement of the planet?
Yeah, I don't know. The planetary wave is shifted.
Yeah, right.
Got another question.
Yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff, thank you. I was just wondering, could you comment on why you think there's that 2-year lag between the climate signal and the ecological signal?
Yeah, so this is again where I had to depend on my ecology colleagues to teach me the reproductive cycle of trees. So there's I think, is it the pine that has a 3-year, and other coniferous species are more typically 2, is that correct?
Yeah, so part of it is basically in order to kind of, what we hypothesize is that the birds are basically leaving because of lack of food, right? So there's a mast year, and then that mast year really is set up about 2 years before that.
Okay.
In terms of, that's what they call sort of a delta T model of massing, which is that the climate conditions kind of have to be well suited, like 2 years in a row before you get a big mass event. And so it is decoupled from that eruption.
Yeah, kind of as we try to illustrate here, the basic idea would be, we're interested in this eruption of, in this case, pine siskins from the boreal forest down into the Appalachian region, so that would be in this direction. Presumably that's driven by a seed crop gradient. So you have a small seed crop where their population may be large, and a larger seed crop to the south where their population is small. And so either by genius or diffusion, they would make their way south in that case. And so that seed crop presumably leads the eruption by a season or two, but that seed crop, due to the reproductive cycle of the tree, was likely driven by climate anomalies which happened in spring of the preceding year. We tag our eruption years in the calendar year in which they finish. So if it's an eruption in 1990, that would be winter ending in 1990. So like, December 1989 ending. And so that would give you the 2 years. Similarly for this one here, so this is the east-west eruption mode. The climate anomalies that drive that, again, are presumably 2 years back so that they have time to operate on the tree reproductive cycle. Yeah. And that thanks for that question. This process of uncovering this started with some theoretical basis for how we thought it might work, but also a comprehensive analysis of all possible options. So we studied this in detail of looking at climate anomalies in all possible seasons, at all possible lags to exhaustion, and then found the ones that made sense with what we thought the underlying physics and ecology were.
This being more of a general question, thanks for the talk. So you actually have a pretty rich data set, both in terms of, sorry for the vastness, birds and seeds, right? I mean, and you have to have that, I would argue, both temporally but spatially as well. Can you comment on at what point can you no longer really get strong enough patterns out of the, say, the EOF? How long, I mean, I'm asking a question that probably there's no good answer to, right? Because it's all about statistics. But I would imagine there's other bird species or other, I don't know anything about seeds, but other kind of food data sets, for example, you just can't do this on, right? Because you don't have the richness of data. You'll take more data if you can get it here, right? But where does that kind of start to break down?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, this research was possible because of Project Feeder Watch and just the density of observations that are available from these citizen scientists. There are other data sets available. So Christmas bird count, I think, has the advantage of being longer, but it's a shorter observation record. eBird has some advantages in terms of the type of data that are collected and how they're tagged, but it's a shorter record. So it was that Project Feeder Watch was that sweet spot of having sufficient data quality over a sufficiently long period of time to actually do this analysis. How much do you need? So when you do EOF analysis, you would like, we usually organize our matrix to be time by location. You would like the time dimension to be larger than the location dimension, which was not the case here. So we're already probably below where we'd like to be, but we're still able to pull it off. And of course, as the record gets shorter, you also run into the mismatch between the time scale of what you're looking at and the available record for it. So in this case, one of the reasons this pops out as the leading mode of variability is the fact that it hit twice over the record, right? Those events where you had huge counts over the continental U.S. with lack of birds over the boreal forest were strong enough in terms of the variant structure in that data set to be the leading mode of variability. That's largely sensitive to probably capturing two of them. Otherwise, modes like this, which are on, off, on, off, on, off, would tend to dominate the variant structure. So, yeah, there's a statistical question related to the number of observations you have versus the number of variables, right, that comes into play. And of course, you want that to be as large in this direction as possible. Yeah, I would say we're comfortably past the cutoff where the uncertainty in our resolution of the EOFs would be a concern, but it's not like we're you know, looking at a century of observations here.
Well, I assume by the time you get to the third EOF, you're probably single digits percent variance and
Yeah.
maybe quite small, right?
Yeah, so to have 42 on the first one and
Pretty good.
13 on the second one, yeah, is not, I mean, in climate science, when we look at something like the North Atlantic Oscillation, that alone might be, say, 23% of the variance in weather variability over the North Atlantic. So at least coming from my field, 42 is not bad for the first EOF. And then, of course, we also want these to be separated from each other too. And I think our third mode was somewhere down in the single digits. But I think your question is also on kind of like the other data sets for which we're not able to do these calculations. There's many more than we have able to do the calculations, I'd say.
Other questions? Yeah.
Just quickly, you have 10 more years of data now. Have you had another eruption event?
Great question. So if you look at the message boards out there, the social media says we did. I saw this post, I think it was on Cornell Ornithology Lab, or something like, every bird's a pine siskin now, or something. And that was it 2023?
It was 23.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that was in 2023, and we went to the data expecting, some huge eruption, but I don't know. So my PhD student extended the data, Ben provided from his lab, and it was just kind of flat down here. There wasn't a big eruption in 2023, even though there was an eruption on social media. There was not an eruption in our data set. So I was asking Ben about this yesterday. I'm thinking maybe is that it was regional. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I think a couple things actually is that, and Ivy's got a nice paper on this, is that some of these eruptions, their frequency and their magnitude are changing. And so part of that we think, we don't quite know why that is the case, but some of these populations are declining. And so even though that eruption did happen in sort of a more regionalized area, it certainly wasn't of the magnitude that it used to be. And I think we're seeing that for a lot of different species, actually.
Great. Any final questions? All right, well, let's thank Court one more time.